Okay, so let me introduce our speaker today. Oliver Kendall is a lifelong political nerd, and as DA's new comms chair, Aaron Fishbone calls him, DA's own Brian Taylor Cohn. Oliver studied security policy and worked in liberal politics in the US before moving abroad. Following a year in Southeast Asia, he's now lived in Spain for a little over 5 years, during which time he's volunteered with DA primarily in communications roles, with the Global Communications Team and the Taxation Task Force. In his spare time, Oliver hosts the podcast OK Talks, where he, both on his own and with a variety of guests, interprets the politics of the US for an international audience and tries to shed light on global events for the folks back home. So Oliver, I'll let you take it from here. Please let us know if you want to be interrupted or if you prefer to have questions at the end.
Oh, I hadn't thought of that actually. I will say, I spent most of today furiously trying to finish a thing at the final stages of an MBA application that I have to turn at the end of tonight instead of preparing for this, which is what I should have been doing most of the day. So, I'm inclined to say if people want to ask a question, do a hand thingy and yeah, by all means. If there are more at the end, also that. But yeah, I think it's better if I have this be a sort of at least a little bit back and forth, considering that although I'm going heavily off of like, part of what I did on a podcast episode a little while ago, it's I don't know, a little more freewheeling because of how chaotic everything is around me at the moment. Um, Actually, how does that work? Do I see the hand thing, or can people just like put a message in the chat or something?
Yeah, our preferred method is for you to type * hand up in the chat box, and then
Great.
I'll just let you know if that
Okay.
happens.
Sounds good. All
Okay.
right. So yeah, well, thank you for the introduction. I guess I am here because I in the last couple of months did several podcast episodes about this. And I should say, in terms of discussing the question of minor parties at the presidential level in the United States, one of the most important things, just in terms of thinking about it in a number of different ways and contexts, is the need to be able to hold multiple contradictory seeming ideas in our head at the same time. So like there are, for example, there are communications and like PR consideration in terms of like where one shares some of those ideas. There are like certain audiences where certain punches should be pulled for the sake of like building trust and winning votes, with this audience being made up of partisan Democrats and party activists. I'm probably not going to be doing very much of the punch pulling today. We'll see. Um, but one example of this right off the bat is whenever I discuss the issue of everything okay? All right. Whenever I discuss uh, the sort of the question of minor parties and anything along these lines, um, certainly with people who are more inclined to support them, either Americans or people elsewhere who just don't understand why we have the rigid two-party thing that we have, uh, they'll often say, yeah, well, you're a partisan Democrat and you don't want to, support minor parties because you think it'll compromise the power of your own party or something. And no, that's not true in my case. I mean, instead, the following are true. One, yes, I am a partisan Democrat, but two, I think that the two-party system is a very bad thing in the United States that's absolutely tearing the country apart. I mean, there is a reason that the blockbuster movie this summer was about a literal civil war in the United States. And three, although I may think that voting at the presidential level, at least for a minor party in an attempt to fix that, or really for almost any other reason, is almost always an act of either confusion or, yes, sorry, straight up moral narcissism, at least when the stakes are as high as they are right now. So I'm going to talk for the next little while about the damages that have been done by minor party presidential campaigns, and then a bit about the sort of players and risks this time around. So additionally, I will say, if there's time and depending on, if there are questions or whatever, I'm maybe talk about how additional parties could potentially grow in the United States in a way that doesn't involve effectively playing Russian roulette with the possibility of a return of Donald Trump, and isn't risking the end of American democracy and liberal Western civilization as we know it. I will also say, if we don't have time for that, that gets explored quite a bit more in episode 67 of the podcast OK Talks, which you can find on YouTube or Spotify or Apple Podcasts or wherever else. In that, my unfortunate victim guest was a guy who has previously worked with the Forward Party, whose thesis is focused in building third-party movements in the United States. So that's an interesting conversation for anybody who really wants to explore the possibility of how additional parties could be built in the United States. So as we get into the question of the damage that can be done by minor party presidential campaigns, it's necessary to at least touch on the systemic factors that are somewhat unique to the United States that make minor party presidential campaigns invariably a windmill tilting vanity project. I'm sure that everyone on this call and everyone who ever listens to the recording of this is already quite familiar with how terrible the Electoral College is, so I'll skip that. But I do think that it is necessary to at least mention the first past the post problem, how it compares to the way that most other liberal democracies choose their head of government. So whenever talking about this, I use what I like to call the dinner analogy, which works great for me because I like cooking and eat way too much food. Oh boy. So the way I describe this is basically, imagine a scenario where there are 10 people who are going to an absolutely obligatory dinner. It is not a dinner where you can get out of it at the last minute by pulling out your phone and faking a text message about a family emergency. You must go. And at this hypothetical obligatory dinner, two want burgers, where there are 10 people, by the way. Two want burgers, one wants Italian, three want Mexican, and four want dog food. So there are a number of ways of choosing which cuisine option we're going to go with in the context of that. So, here in Spain with its parliamentary system, they take a vote to get a sense for where people are, and then with the results being known, we can assume the human food people would presumably get together and decide on Italian as a compromise, because although they really don't want to eat dog food, the burger people are afraid of Mexican food because it's too spicy, and well, we know people here don't handle spicy food that well. So, another option would be like a runoff system, as is the case in France or a number of Latin American countries, where you would have one initial vote with all of the food options on the table, and then there would be a second runoff vote after that, wherein the top two from the first vote would be chosen, at which point presumably Mexican food would win. Because it would have advanced to the next round, and we assume that the 6 combined people who don't want to eat dog food would vote for Mexican food. But in America, with the first past the post system, dog food for everybody, in the context of the choice that we're dealing with here, which, of course, as we know, incentivizes the formation in advance of 2 major blocks prior to the election, which is the way it is in the United States. And refusing to acknowledge that, or I guess to put it charitably, taking a principled stand against that and refusing to choose between the 2 realistic options that are available, does not result in the system changing. It results in you having contributed directly to forcing yourself and everyone around you to eat dog food. So, there are a number of reasons why a small number of people in the United States choose to do that anyway, almost none of them good, and which, again, we may or may not get into depending on time, because I want to pivot now to some of the past, harms and current threats vis-a-vis minor parties. So first, most recent example, I'm tempted to go back to 1968, but I think that there are a number of other factors that made the inclusion of George Wallace in that race a weird one, so I may or may not touch on that, or probably save it for later. 2000, first election I ever followed as a 7-year-old in Washington, D.C., learning dimple ballots and hanging chads and other things that 7-year-olds probably shouldn't know about. I assume most of the people on the call are old enough to remember how that election looked at the time. I remember election night looked like Gore had won. It looked like we were in good shape. Obviously that didn't end up happening for a bunch of factors that we could get into, like the aforementioned hanging chads or the Supreme Court or Jeb Bush's involvement or various other things. But I'm just going to focus in on one. 500 votes, approximately 500 votes. That's how many votes Al Gore lost by when, again, putting the recount issues aside, 500 votes approximately is the number of votes that officially Al Gore lost by in Florida, out of a total of 6 million, approximately. So 500 out of approximately 6 billion. Now, here's another number I want people to focus in on. 97,000. 97,000. That is approximately the number of votes that Ralph Nader got in Florida. Now, Nader himself in the years afterward was like, yeah, well, some of my people voted, were more supportive of the Republicans. So if I wasn't there, it wouldn't have mattered anyway. But like, that's silly. There is no way that if Ralph Nader was not on the ballot in Florida, that enough Nader voters would have voted for Gore out of the total 97,000, that it would have made up for a 500 vote deficit, which is what Al Gore again lost by in Florida. Nationally, Ralph Nader got about 3% of the vote. Okay, I mean, a couple more votes, he'd be right there in the running. But, in a first past the post system, his 3% nationally, and more importantly, his 97,000 votes in Florida, delivered the presidency to George Bush. No George Bush presidency, no war in Iraq, probably no financial crisis, no ridiculous like deficit exploding tax cuts, no torture scandal, no Harriet Miers Supreme Court, no Justice Anthony, no Samuel Alito and John Roberts. To quote George Bush himself, and I apologize to everyone for doing this, but I'm just going to do it. Our enemies are innovative and resourceful, and so are we. They never stop thinking about new ways to harm our country and our people, and neither do we. It would have been really great if George Bush had not been the president, I guess, is the point that I'm driving at. And as a result, I am forced to say that it would have been really great if Ralph Nader had found something else to do in the year 2000. Next example, 2016. Again, here, as with all the stuff in Florida this time, I could say a lot of things about sexism and an active information warfare campaign run by America's primary geostrategic adversary, or the stupid, preening, ridiculous actions of a morally superior FBI director, or bad behavior in the primaries by certain people and their supporters. But rather than focus in on any of that, I will again focus in on the issue at hand. Hillary Clinton wins the popular vote by about 3 million, and her presidency is scuttled by the results in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, all states in which the margin was substantially less than the number of votes that went to minor party candidates. When it comes to the Green Party candidate, Jill Stein, who I will get back to slapping around in a minute, metaphorically, the margin in Michigan and Wisconsin of Jill Stein alone was substantially more than the amount that Hillary lost by. Jill Stein didn't get quite as many votes as was the actual margin in Pennsylvania, but the combination of the voters for Gary, what is Aleppo, Johnson, and Jill Stein in Pennsylvania substantially outstripped the actual margin there, and I have to imagine that a decent number of the Johnson voters probably would have gone to Hillary as well, which combined with the hypothetical Stein voters that would have gone there, again, if I were to actually go through if Trump hadn't been the president, the following things wouldn't have happened. We'd all be here until next week, so I won't do that. The moral of the story is, I'm not going to say the only reason that George Bush and Donald Trump became presidents of the United States was the involvement of minor parties, but they certainly did not help. And I use the word help advisedly, as I may or may not say more about, but I will just say for now, various former Republican strategists like Rick Wilson and various others have come straight out and said how, oh yeah, we, the Republicans, frequently try to encourage, minor party candidates in various races as a way of messing with the Democrats, because it seems to, at least in recent years, be more of a problem on our side than theirs. So I'm going to just pivot for a minute now and talk a little bit about some of the risks of minor parties that are on the table this year in terms of which ones are there. In the podcast episode that I did about this, I talked for quite a bit about no labels, which I will largely skip over now because that appears to have fizzled out. The no labels thing is relevant to the help point in the sense that the primary donors to no labels, at least in recent years, have also been, by coincidence, high-profile Trump donors. So it seemed to imply that there may have been an ulterior motive there. But at the end of the day, again, no labels seem to be having their rationale based on the idea of recruiting some sort of high-profile, moderate, the 5 that remain nationally in the United States. And all of those people seem to have the political acumen to realize that it would be a ridiculous vanity project that would have the result of putting Donald Trump back in the Oval Office, and bowed out and thus died the no labels presidential campaign of 2024. So what's left then? Jill Stein, who I mentioned before, Dr. Jill Stein, I should say, as I mentioned before, who is again the nominee of the Green Party. And it just needs to be noted here. Maybe I say this as somebody who worked for a company that had some relationship with the European Green Party. Um, the American Green Party is not like other Green parties. A number of countries have Green parties that field serious candidates that are focused on actual policy change and realistic solutions that look more like, again, concrete policies and less like levitating the Pentagon. But the American Green Party does not fit into that pantheon of Green parties that are elsewhere, and I think that we need to try very hard to make sure that they do not get the credit that would come with being connected to Green parties elsewhere. Jill Stein herself has some uncomfortable connections to the Russians. People all remember probably from 2016 the picture of her at that dinner with Putin and Mike Flynn, which is weird. And we also know that some of the Russian interference in 2016 focused on boosting Jill Stein's candidacy. Also in 2016, she led like an active effort to go and try to mess with the Democratic National Committee, which, again, not super normal, serious presidential candidate behavior. And then this year, in addition to, her past stuff with this, she has recently been flirting with the idea of having as her vice presidential nominee a guy named Abdullah Hamid. Now, for anybody who doesn't know, Abdullah Hamid is the mayor of Dearborn. He is technically a Democrat, but in his role as the mayor of Dearborn over the last number of months, he has quite frequently gone on national television and, without wanting to editorialize too heavily on this topic, has engaged in uh, borderline anti-Semitic misinformation and has widely and frequently slandered President Biden and lied about his record on a number of different issues. Of course, I could say how strange it is that a mayor of a small city in a Midwestern state would be on national television to talk about foreign policy and why that might be. You'll just have to ask Joy Reid. But the point that I'm trying to make here is the flirtation with the idea of making Abdullah Hamid the vice presidential nominee. It's not going to deliver Jill Stein the presidency. It's not a person who's super qualified to step into the job were she to croak on day 2 in the Oval Office. What it looks like to me is an obvious attempt to screw with the Democrats in one of the 3 most important swing states, which is not the sort of thing you do if your presidential campaign is an earnest attempt to draw attention to a set of issues that you care about and try to win. It's rather what you do if your presidential campaign is an attempt to mess with and undermine the presidential campaign of the party that is more close to your ideological profile. Bad faith, I guess, is how I would think about that. As of like a month ago, I didn't get around to checking today, but as of like a month ago, Jill Stein is on the ballot in Arizona, North Carolina, Florida, Michigan, and Wisconsin. And I'm sure the efforts continue to get onto the ballot elsewhere. Next after Jill Stein and the Green Party, there is Dr. Cornel West. I am, for a number of reasons, not the right person to talk about Dr. Cornel West's evolution as an academic. I will leave that to a great piece written in the New Republic about a decade ago by Michael Eric Dyson. But I will just say, as a general principle, that, Dr. West is somebody who for quite a while now has liked to traffic in the kind of ivory tower unserious leftism that has a lot more to do with helping to inflate the awesome sense of moral superiority among those espousing it than it does to do with helping actual people in any way that is tangible at all. Furthermore, Dr. West has taken a rather dim view of the more successful liberal or progressive presidents to date. Specifically, here he is on President Obama, quote, a black mascot of Wall Street oligarchs and a black muppet of corporate plutocrats, and now he has become the head of the American killing machine and is proud of it. Also, quote, a Rockefeller Republican in blackface, unquote. I think others can draw their own conclusions as to whether or not President Obama is a Rockefeller Republican in blackface. I don't think so. I'm willing to hazard a guess that most other Democrats probably don't think so either. And, again, not a super constructive approach here. after Dr. West, there is RFK Jr., the worm candidate. Uh, there's a lot of things that could be said about RFK Jr., but I guess I will just say, well, I started off the podcast episode that I did about minor parties by referencing the fact that about a week before I did that podcast, the Biden campaign put out an ad with basically the entire adult cast of the Kennedy family, coming out and talking about why he, that is to say, President Biden, is the true inheritor of the JFK and RFK legacy. Hintity, hint, hint, please don't vote for our insane uncle. Um, this is important, and I hope that the campaign does more of this because polls tend to show that the more people know about RFK Jr., the less interested they are in his candidacy, which might have something to do with the fact that, well, in case there's anyone who doesn't already know exactly who RFK Jr. is, he started off a couple decades ago as an environmental lawyer who did good work in a number of areas, and then basically just like veered off into cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs conspiracy theory land. In terms of like he's like the OG anti-vaxxer. This is not a person who was just a little bit leery of the COVID vaccines. Like this is a measles vaccine, causes autism, like the whole shebang. He's been on this for quite a long time. Also, I mentioned the COVID thing a second ago, although he was, in addition to being against, the COVID vaccines, I believe he is on the record as having speculated that the virus might have been genetically targeted to go after white and black people, but spare Chinese and the Jews. Wouldn't be a proper conspiracy theory if we didn't find a way to drop a little anti-Semitism in there. He, I think, has also gone after the polio vaccine. Outside the vaccine stuff, this is somebody who genuinely just doesn't appear to have ever met a conspiracy theory that he didn't like. Like I on that podcast episode, I rattled off. He has claimed that the CIA murdered his uncle, so I guess that's Ted Cruz's dad officially off the hook. He has claimed that Wi-Fi causes brain cancer and also 5G towers, I think, or maybe they're emitting radiation, something along those lines, I believe. Also, mass shootings in America probably caused by antidepressants. So, keep that in mind the next time you consider taking an SSRI, if you have access to guns, that is, I suppose. Yeah, it's a bunch of very, very weird conspiracy theory stuff, which also seems to bleed into a tendency to just be willing to lie about almost anything else. Like there are a number of other anecdotes. There was one involving Jake Tapper a little while ago where RFK Jr. came out with some story about how he'd been like working with Jake Tapper on something until corporate killed it, which Jake Tapper came out and was like, I have no idea what this guy is talking about. But okay, just not a super firm grasp on reality when it comes to conspiracy theory stuff, and then just more broadly. Also, did I mention there's a dead worm in his brain? Outside of the very weird beliefs thing, it's really hard kind of to tell what RFK Jr.'s candidacy is actually about. His positions are vague on a number of things. He's made statements that imply that he might be in favor of a national abortion ban, and then reversed that, said he never said it, now never talks about it. It's anti-corporate vibes seem to be the entire basis of the candidate. A sprinkling of conspiracy theories and anti-corporate vibes. Maybe we faked the moon landing. I don't know. But like, that's very ironic when one considers his vice presidential pick. Because, if you asked, who the hell is Nicole Shanahan about a month and a half ago, you were not alone. Turns out that instead of Jesse Ventura or fading quarterback and conspiracy theorists Aaron Rodgers apparently were not picked. I guess neither of them had enough money, which could not be said of Nicole Shanahan, who, again, nobody'd ever heard of her. But this woman is apparently has a lot of money because she married the CEO of Google, and also founded like a biotech company, and is basically able to finance the efforts to get RFK Jr. onto the ballot. And other than that, to quote Liz Smith of the DNC, has apparently basically, besides her efforts to fund RFK Jr.'s attempt to get on the ballot, has been put into the witness protection program because nobody has seen or heard from her, with the exception of like one or two recent interviews, which, spoiler alert, did not go well. The big question, I think, in a lot of ways, is the one of whether RFK Jr. will do more damage to Biden or to Trump in terms of where he's on the ballot. I go back and forth on this. I think that all of the efforts being taken by the DNC to show people who RFK Jr. is are probably helpful because, again, polls show that when you get past name recognition to people actually knowing anything about the guy, they tend to be like, whoa. But insofar as people know stuff about RFK Jr. and like them, my assumption is that most of those people, especially post-COVID, are more likely to be Trump supporters, since I think a lot of the sort of like anti-vax, conspiracy theory type voters in America, which I think used to be split pretty evenly between the right and the left. I think a decent number of them have moved to the new home of anti-vaxxerism. So I don't know. A part of me thinks that RFK Jr. will actually help us rather than hurt us, but I don't have enough numbers to be able to back that up. And regardless of my opinion on that, we should be doing everything we can to make sure that everybody who wants an alternative because they don't like the two-party system and didn't properly understand my dog food analogy earlier, who might think about voting for a minor party candidate who thinks about voting for him, needs to, understand more about who they would be hypothetically voting for, because this is not a person who's serious or ready to be president in any way more than Donald Trump is. So, bad.
To go.
I think,
I'll catch up the rest online. Thanks.
sorry. Oh, so yeah. I will say I've been talking for a while and I feel bad about that fact. Sorry, Robert, in your comment, are you referring to the fact that Cornel West referred to Trump as my brother Trump? If so, he calls everybody that. It's not really indicative. But Cornel West also somebody who we really should not want to be the president unless we want Ukraine to be owned by the Russians along with the entire rest of NATO. The point I'm building to here, running the world is serious business. RFK Jr., not a serious guy. None of the other minor party candidates are serious people. I don't think I need to say that about Donald Trump, but I don't think any serious person wants Jill Stein running the United States either. Nor is it conceivable that she could, or Cornel West or RFK Jr. Americans, I always argue, have a greater responsibility than the citizens of other countries to be more serious and not less serious in the way they vote at the presidential level, given the extent to which what happens in our government has a greater effect on the rest of the world than what happens in any other. And as a result, I always argue against people voting for minor party candidates at the presidential level. And fairly often when I do that, I'll get some sort of, yeah, man, the system's just rigged, man. Both parties are corrupt, and I can hear hypothetical people who take that position taking issue with a number of what I've said here. And as a result, my inclination is to push back in terms of the notion that I would be making all of these arguments just because I'm a partisan Democrat. There are various ways in which third parties could be built in the United States that would not be actively damaging to the country and the world in the way that it basically would result in Donald Trump returning to the White House. Do people want to talk more about the possibility of how additional parties could grow in a way that's not dangerous, or are there things people want to weigh in on everything that I've said so far?
Anyone have any thoughts?
Andrea, go for it.
It's actually Carl, and Andy's listening too.
I'm here too. We're both here.
But so I was just wondering, looking back on third-party candidacies, H. Ross Perot in 1992 had a pretty significant impact on the election, and I'm wondering, would Bill Clinton have been president if Perot hadn't run? You ever think about that?
Yeah, that's a great question for the person who I had as my guest on episode, I want to say 67 of OK Talks, which you should totally go listen to, he said, shamelessly plugging himself. As I recall, Spencer, my guest's position was that, yeah, probably Bill Clinton doesn't win without Ross Perot. And Ross Perot is another example in a lot of ways, and I don't say this in any way as an endorsement of Ross Perot, but of the reality that there are multiple different ways in which the American system for choosing a head of government is very stacked against a new party coming in. Ross Perot won 18% of the vote nationally. He got 0 electoral votes. That's nuts. I mean, like that's that's a weird number. And off the top of my head, the only time that I'm aware of, I don't know. Bear in mind, I don't know what the numbers are for the Bull Moose candidacy of Teddy Roosevelt in 1912. But within the last 100 years, the only time in which anyone that isn't a Democrat or a Republican got electoral votes that I'm aware of is when George Wallace got like 40 electoral votes in 1968. And you know, that's interesting. And I think that that is something that reflects the fact that there was a realignment going on at the time in terms of who belonged to which party, and the fact that George Wallace's candidacy was itself basically taking a longstanding and existing constituency of the Democratic Party with him out of the party to vote for his creepy little neo-Confederate thing, which Ross Perot was not able to do. He was not like a person who was a longstanding member of one of the two parties in the midst of a realignment, you know, basically taking part of the party with him somewhere else. But I know that George Bush Sr. thinks that without Ross Perot, he would not have lost. I think that a decent number of people that are supportive of Clinton also think that and recognize that. But yet again, didn't result in Ross Perot becoming the president, nor getting anywhere near it. 0 electoral votes. So, yeah.
So just a quick follow-up. So it just seemed to me that it was really the first time I thought about the electoral vote system really being indicted. It was like, you got to be kidding me. You know, this guy got all these votes all across the country. And for what it's worth, I think a lot of the people that voted for him, that yes, there were certainly people who were like, well, both parties are the same and I want somebody different. But I think that also it was, you know, this guy isn't a politician and he didn't talk like a politician. And I think that people found that, I don't know, new and different, you know, a contrast, whatever term you want to use. And I think that it would take for a third party to really stick, it would take somebody like that with a boatload of money and an ego to match and enough time. I mean, Perot was not young. Okay. We need somebody who's, you know, 48 years old, who's got more money than Croesus, who's, you know, decided that changing American politics needs to happen, and just go out there with this third party thing going on. And, you know, because Perot actually did, you know, he had that, I forget what it was called, that third party for a while. It stuck around for 4 extra years. It was there totally like around for about 8 years. So anyway, yeah, it's just, I think that's probably what it would take. And I don't know that we've got, I mean, right now, I think somebody like Jeff Bezos, you know, with enough money that he could just keep spending and keep spending. But I don't know, you know, he probably doesn't want to, but it's somebody who's got the ego that wants to do it.
I would say there is an additional problem, which is just the reality of the Electoral College. I think just makes it virtually impossible to imagine that happening. I mean, like, I think in a scenario where the National Popular Vote Compact passes enough states that we have 270, then I think that could be imaginable. But if I were to go into this more, and I think my guest would have agreed, the only way that a third party in the United States could seriously develop is by not starting at the presidential level. I mean, like, because for one thing, when you run for president as a minor party candidate, you face the vast majority of us being like, dude, what are you doing? You're making it so that, you know, the other one that is less close to your ideological alignment will win. And we are right to be doing that, by the way. Like, I have debated how much I wanted to take swings at the kinds of people who would not vote, you know, who would vote for a minor party out of little ideological disputes at their coalition, and I may still do that. But like, we are right to make that argument. Like, at least like in whether or not it works to go tell a person who's thinking about voting for Jill Stein, you are actively delivering the presidency to Donald Trump. Whether or not that's effective to do to them, and I think that's an open debate. I do think that we in private should have no illusions as to the reality that voting for Jill Stein is no different than voting for Donald Trump. A person who takes a principled stand to refuse to, vote in the context of the system we have, you're making everybody else eat dog food. Like it's not, you're not taking a principled stand, to represent Italian food at the dinner table. You're forcing puppy chow down everybody else's throat. And I notice a lot. I've even seen some of this in the Signal group from the Barcelona group lately. There is a real tendency among a lot of us who are on the left, particularly who are Democratic Party activists who skew further left than a lot of the people that actually vote in the party, who are the actual base, not just, the people that are loud. There's a tendency to want to basically either accept or help the narrative of like, yeah, well, especially those of us that live in places like Europe that have all of the kind of, more socialistic things that we would like to see back home. There is sometimes I see a tendency for people to basically capitulate to the notion of, well, in an ideal world, sure, I would love to have a president who is representative of like the American Green Party, but we have to be realistic, so we're voting for Democrats. And I don't think that that's a good idea. I think that the notion that we would basically capitulate to the notion of, oh yeah, well, we wish the party was further left, but it's the best we got. No, we've seen over the last number of months, and we can see in the context of certain other sort of authoritarian left countries, that there is a bad part of the far left. And the notion that the way we get those people back or that we win elections is by basically coddling certain people who are not loyal Democrats, who are people that are constantly throwing arrows at the shooting arrows at the party from outside, from the left. The notion that we need to win by like coddling those people, or basically saying, yeah, well, you have a point. I wish that our party looked more like that, but it's not. So just swallow, what's the word? Hold your nose and do this. I would posit as an alternative to this, look at the British Labour Party over the last decade and a half. The British Labour Party went absolutely off the deep end, far left. They had a real anti-Semitism problem for a while, and they were unelectable for like a decade and a half. Over the last 2 or 3 years or so, the sane people in that party punched left quite a lot. I mean, they attacked repeatedly the fringe of their own side, dragged the party back to a place where they could actually win. And as a result, they're now going to have a huge majority and are going to have power in that country for the first time in a decade and a half. I think the first Clinton presidency is also a bit of an example of that working. But I guess the point I'm trying to make here is, at least among ourselves in private, I don't think there's any reason why we need to, from a messaging standpoint, when speaking to certain audiences, it makes sense to take their concerns seriously and listen to them. But I take the concerns seriously of Republicans when I listen to them too. Like, I can hear their concerns and try to tell them why I think Joe Biden is the best president for them based on the issues that they gave me. And I can do that for them just as effectively as I can for somebody who's like, yeah, well, hashtag genocide Joe, something, something, I'm going to vote for Jill Stein because I want to cut the military budget into fractions. I don't see that there's any reason why we should be more, at least in private, like respectful of people that are going to vote for minor parties that are to our left than we are of people that would vote for RFK or people that are moderate Republicans. Yeah, I don't know if that made sense. I went on way longer than I intended to and made like 3 different points that weren't what I intended, but that I thought should be said at some point among Democrats. We need to be assured of our positions. And I think when approaching people from potential minor party candidates, acting as though we're not actually convinced by our own party's messaging does not help. Annie, I think you're muted. And also, I think Robert had a hand.
Sorry, I was talking to my husband.
Oh.
There's a comment in here from Mary Ann, which I don't know if, Mary Ann, if you want to make that out loud or just, we can just read it. And then after that, Rob has his hand up.
I don't know if Mary Ann's still there.
Hold on. No, I just said thank you. You answered my question about this election. I was concerned when I saw the title there, what do you mean a third party?
Huh.
And I wasn't aware of the whole trip with the Green Party. I wasn't aware that was going on, or even who that woman was.
Yeah.
And
Better off.
but I'm thinking hopefully she and RFK will cancel each other out.
I gotta be
And
honest.
New York-
To that point specifically, I'm afraid not. I mean, there is some crossover in the sense that she's also said some weird like anti-vaccine conspiracy stuff, and both she and RFK Jr.'s foreign policy is basically to like do the Thanos glove, destroy it thing to the Pentagon. But I think that other than that, I
I should
don't.
tell you, I used to be a teacher, and those parents who are anti-vaccine, they're also very antisocial, and they're not voters.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. This is why my position in terms of various things, and I've only had this attitude reinforced by a number of events over the last 8 or 9 months, is that it is never a good idea to build a party coalition on the basis of voters that are unreliable, or voters that tell you that if you don't compromise on my one issue, I will not vote for you, even if I agree with you on everything else.
Yeah.
That, I mean, in the same way that like the Republican Party, most Republicans do not believe what the craziest 5% of their party does on guns. But the Republicans have effectively had to swallow that position on guns of being completely against any sort of restriction, even though polls show the vast majority of them are effectively with us. But the party itself can't shift on that issue at all because they are beholden to the 5% or so of their party that vote exclusively on that issue.
And the
Single issue-
NRA.
Yes, but the NRA helps create single issue voters. My point is single issue voters are not who you want to build your party on, which is why when I see over and over and over again, and I think I could say this without actually touching foreign policy, when I see over and over and over again, every 5 minutes, Politico runs a story, oh my God, Biden's going to lose Michigan because certain voters in Michigan expect that he would upend 75 years of American foreign policy to accommodate their one desire on an issue. Well, those aren't people that we want to base our party coalition on. You want people who will show up consistently in midterms and at the presidential level. You want people that are not the kinds of people that need to be extra inspired to come and vote. And you want people that are willing to see the bigger picture rather than being like, screw you, I disagreed on one issue, so I'm not voting for you, or I'm going to go vote for this minor party, or I'm going to vote for the other guy, or I'm going to stay home.
Right. And also the rest of my chat, I said, I subscribe to both. So it was either the Washington Post or the New Yorker. One of them did a deal on Generation Z and how they're probably going to lean towards Biden because of the abortion issues and mostly abortion. Well,
The other unsung issue that's not being reported enough is the extent to which older voters are coming back to the Democrats, which I am, I think 2 years too old to be Gen Z, thank God. But like if I'm building a party, I've been jealous of the Republicans for a long time over the fact that they don't get hammered in midterms the way Democrats do because their voters are reliable, practical, largely older people who understand, well, there's one party who understand the reality that when faced with a choice that is binary, you have to pick the option that is the least worst option for you. I had that logic drummed into me through my entire undergraduate, program because I was studying international security policy. And when it comes to foreign policy and security stuff, there are bad choices and worse choices, and you have to make the decision between those. You rarely are choosing between unicorns and something really bad. So I've had that logic internalized for a long time. But a lot of people, they're like, well, I don't like either of these choices, so I'm not going to look any further than that. I'm just going to either not vote or I'm going to go do a stupid protest vote or something like that. And look at me, I'm so morally pure because I didn't get my hands dirty by voting for the lesser of two evils. But the reality is that a person who does that is lazy. It's lazy and selfish and privileged and narcissistic. And now would I say that to them if I were trying to get them to vote for my person? No. But I don't see any reason why we, among loyal Democrats, should be making excuses for people like that or calling them the base. The base are the people that show up. I've always been very jealous of the Republican base, and the fact that some of the people that used to be the Republican base seem to be shifting into the Democratic Party. Great, I'll take them. And if we have to trade older folks for the kids, I'll take the older folks any day of the week, because I would love to not have to be in suspense until election night to see whether or not Generation Z showed up. I hope they do. I would love for them to. But for me, these not very often covered polls of the fact that older voters in droves seem to be shifting toward Biden. Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good
Because he
thing.
lost, and apparently the Republicans have lost again suburban women because
Yeah.
of the abortion thing.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I don't know. There are a number of things that I have more in common with the kids than with the older folks. You know, like there are certain policy issues where I'm probably more aligned with younger people. Lifestyle issues, I guess, where I'm more in line with the younger people than the older ones. But like, boy, when it comes to who I want in my party coalition, you know, I'll take the people that show up consistently. And you know, it's weird that I'll be saying this in the context of it, you know, talking about minor parties, where probably what I should be talking about is how to win those people back. But I guess the broader.
But I retired here because I couldn't afford to stay in the States. Plus, I lived here when I was a teenager, but I've always wanted to come back. But Gen Z is busy. Half their pay going to rent.
Yeah.
They probably have 1.5 jobs at least.
Yeah, all that is true. You know, and I would love for them to be given, you know, at every job, you know, an hour of study time every day so they can actually read up on the differences between the Biden agenda and the Trump agenda, rather than just being like, yeah, well, lesser of two evils, I'm not voting. But, you know, we don't have the ability to give them that time, so the best we can do is make the case as best as we can and make it unapologetically. Because I think Bill Clinton was absolutely right in the strong and wrong wins over weak and right thing. And I think that, I guess if I have one message for Democrats when it comes to discussing the presidential election, I think we can be unapologetic in our defense of and support for the Democratic Party's agenda as a successful progressive or liberal party, without needing to do the sort of mealy mouth, yeah, well, yeah, I'm like you, I wish the party was further to the left, but kind of thing. Because like that's silly. It's not going to convince anybody. And by the way, the most successful progressive presidents in the history of the United States have always been old, boring white men who are in the Senate, who everybody considered to be moderates at the time. The left hated FDR, they hated LBJ, and they hate Joe Biden. And those three have been by far the most successful liberal presidents in the modern history of the United States. And those of us that recognize that fact should not in any way be shy about making that case. Sorry, I keep talking and I see Rob has a thing.
Yeah, Rob has a question.
No, I was listening. It was very, very good. It just brought up another idea from my original too. But the first thing I was going to say was that RFK Jr. is actually running really right on things like January 6th, inexplicably. And his VP, who is actually Elon's girlfriend, is running really right on abortion. So I don't think that that's going to be the issue at all. The issue I see is that in 2020, 80 million people didn't show up to vote. Like, it was the most important election. This one is probably more important, but Trump actually had the White House, and 80 million people still couldn't get over shit to actually go vote at that point. So I think I agree with you. Chasing after low propensity voters who slander us constantly probably isn't the right strategy. But when you look at actual policy positions that this administration has taken, laws they've gotten passed, EOs, judges, it all lines up with what everybody of a certain age range say are the most important issues of their life. So when you talk about climate change being an existential threat, Joe Biden is the climate change president. You talk about women's reproductive rights, talk about democracy, talk about voting rights. I mean, if they take the time to actually look it up, I think we're in good shape. But what I was going to say was the senior vote. A lot of the reasons the senior voter coming around to Biden is stability, and they're less impacted by inflation than normal, like a 22-year-old getting out of college. In a lot of situations that older vote. So I think the stability / they're doing generally better is going to help. But if you look at the most recent polling of the Trump versus Biden matchup, it shows Biden at the exact same number he was the exit polls of 2020. Like, that's the latest news reports on that.
But this is where a key difference between this election and 2020 is that 2020 we did see a miraculous little moment of maturity in which, as I said in this podcast episode, the usual, narcissist and cranks that would run a minor party presidential candidate hung up their boot-shaped hats and their anti-vaccine treatises and stayed. I guess we are allowed to swear in here. I don't know. I heard somebody else do it, so I'm going to do it because I would have been doing it the whole time up until now. Said, fuck it, I'm going to stay home on this one. There was nobody else really on the ballot in 2020. Whereas this time, all of the lunatics that would have been here in an election like that are back out of the woodwork because, they're mad that Biden didn't make it rain 20s. And, also, Biden has been not slandered in the same way that I would say that Hillary Clinton was. But a lot of the same kind of yicky parts of the extreme left have gone after Biden in a way that is very rarely actually connected to his actual agenda or his accomplishments or a basic sense of like what color the sky is. And all of the forces that made those things problematic in the last couple of election cycles have come together to make it way worse now. I mean, TikTok didn't exist in 2020. Not in the way that it does now. And like, and this is where again I think that it's important that yeah, Robert, you're actually right. I just think the boot hat thing is funny. This is why I continue to think it's important for Democrats to be unapologetic in their defense, not only of the president, but of the Democratic Party as like being a responsible party and being willing to attack those who would attack it, not just coming from the right, but coming from the left. A thing that I'm constantly haunted by in this election cycle, partly just because I frequently compare Biden to like, a nicer version of LBJ, a version of LBJ that doesn't make his staffers stand in the bathroom with the door open, as it were. I'm frequently haunted by the 1968 comparison. One difference is that we don't have this massive party realignment happening right now like we did in 68 in the wake of the civil rights thing, with George Wallace basically taking the Confederate chunk of the Democratic Party out the door with him that we hadn't been able to replace yet with more voters from the North. But like, people look back fondly on the late 60s. A lot of the kinds of people that like protests and like activism and are generally against war. A lot of analogies have been made between the anti-Israel protests, and yes, I'm calling them anti-Israel protests advisedly. A lot of analogies have been made between the anti-Israel protests now and the anti-Vietnam War protests in 1968. Now, that is a stupid comparison for a number of reasons, partly because people protesting in 1968 had skin in the game because, they were protesting their own country's involvement in the possibility of them getting drafted rather than just parroting propaganda that they've been internalizing, that Qatar has been shoveling into the universities for the last 20 years. But in 1968, there were these protests and everybody liked it. And they thought, a lot of those of us who are on the left who like activism and protests and anti-war, whatever, look back fondly on the protests of 1968. A lot of the cultural products that have been created that reference that in the time since then are positive. But at the time, well, the first election that got held after those ridiculous, lot less ridiculous than the ones we're seeing now, the chaos that was represented by some of those protests, the fact that it looked like these were protests coming from the further left, attacking a president that most of the country considered to be to the left, and they didn't seem to be able to do anything about it. Well, the next election went to the law and order guy. I remain convinced that Joe Biden would have done much better in 2020, and I say this as somebody who supported the Black Lives Matter protests, but when you started seeing things appearing in NPR that were defensive of looting and rioting and lighting stuff on, that were defensive of anything other than peaceful protests, and yes, stuff like that was written, defund the police, the appearance of disorder on the far left, attacking the left, doesn't tend to play well in the rest of the country. The first election after the 1968 protests went to Richard Nixon, the law and order guy. And I think part of the reason for that is because the Democrats look weak, because their own convention got punked by a bunch of people who probably weren't going to vote anyway, and who basically just got into a fight with the police outside. And I worry very much about how it looks that you have a president that already codes as weak because he's old and because he's from the left, appearing incapable of standing up against the kinds of people who think it's cool to show up outside a synagogue in Los Angeles and beat Jews with sticks, which is what happened over the weekend. And Biden made a statement about that. That's good. But I think that a lot of us should be less hesitant to push back against some of the yickier sides of the activism that we've seen over the last little while, whether or not we're in agreement with Israel's position or with President Biden's position vis-a-vis Israel. I think we should be confident pushing back on the notion that Joe Biden is bad or the Democratic Party is complicit in a genocide or something like this. And I think that plays well with the rest of the country. And I also think that it will be more likely to win back some of the people that are off the left end of this, because again, strong and wrong tends to play better than weak and right. And in this case, we would have the benefit of being strong and right rather than just being mealy-mouthed about it. Again, I talk way too long. And Annie
I have
has
a question. Yes, I have a question, and then we're coming up on the hour, so if I don't see any more comments in the chat box, we can wrap it up after. My question is about the debates, because what Carl asked about Ross Perot made me think. I was pretty young then, but I'm pretty sure that Ross Perot participated in the presidential debates. And as you said, he got a lot more votes than any other third party candidate in many years. Do you think if the third party candidates who are running this year were to participate in the presidential debates, it would help Joe Biden or hurt Joe Biden?
That's a good question. I think it would hurt him. I think it would hurt him a lot, actually. The reason I think it would hurt him a lot, well, I mean, okay. If any of the third party candidates were not fucking clowns, I think it would hurt him a lot.
But they are clowns.
They are, but I think unfortunately, the thing is, what we really need is the contrast. I think, because Biden doesn't code as clown exactly. I mean, he's not articulate because of his speech impediment. He's never been a good public speaker, but he does okay in debates. He did okay in the 2008 primary debates. He kicked Paul Ryan's ass in 2012, and he did okay against Trump in 2020. But I think that the benefit we get from the debates is a really clear contrast. And I think that having RFK Jr. up there dilutes that contrast to a degree, because even if RFK Jr. himself says something crazy, I don't think it'll have the effect of creating a Biden sane, everyone else crazy viewpoint. I think it'll have an effect of being like, oh my God, another older seeming, inarticulate gentleman on the stage saying weird things. I think it dilutes the extent to which Trump appears really insane and like a threat. That's my gut reaction to that.
Well, he might be on the stage in September, so we'll see how.
Might he?
Really?
If he gets on the ballot in a couple more states, yeah.
Oh, but is that based on the Presidential Election Commission debate idea? Because
The CNN requirement this time was that he had to be I think 15% in 3 polls and on enough ballots in enough states to actually win the Electoral College.
Gotcha. Okay.
And
Well,
he's not on enough state ballots yet.
I will say him not being in the upcoming debate, provided Trump doesn't bitch out at the last minute, which I still think is like a 40% chance. Because seriously, I can't believe he agreed to this debate. If I'm being honest, but he has to. But provided this debate happens, I think the question out of that will be, I think as long as Biden doesn't make an ass of himself in this debate in some way, I think it'll help shunt RFK Jr. off to the side, because as long as Biden performs relatively adequately while Trump throws his own feces around the stage, it will clarify the sort of, this is a choice between, old and boring, but not going to kill me versus might rip my face off if I venture into his monkey cage. I think
And
that
also old.
and also old, but in a way that doesn't code old because he's smeared his face with orange lead paint and colored his hair with God only knows what. But My thinking is that if this debate doesn't go badly for Biden, it helps shunt RFK Jr. off to the side, and he hasn't been doing as well lately. And I think the brain worm thing probably didn't help. And I think also the fact that the DNC appears to be actually taking it seriously this time makes it less likely that he gets onto the stage in the next one. But yeah, my take is that it would probably be quite bad for Biden, especially at the last minute, because in 2016. People that made their mind up at the last minute broke overwhelmingly for Donald Trump. People in 2020 that made their mind up at the last minute, I think, went more toward Biden, or people were a little bit more locked in then because Biden didn't have, didn't have as much baggage as Hillary Clinton did. I say, as a person who is undyingly loyal to Hillary Clinton and wish she were the president now, even though I love President Biden. I think this time, given what Biden's up against, that isn't as much the case as 2020, I think that in this case, what we have to count on is enough people thinking, okay, I don't love this guy. The other option is like a shotgun blast to the face. If we get a view of an alternative like 3 weeks before the election, even if that alternative doesn't look great, I think it weakens that sort of dichotomous choice that we have to make. And I think that does not help. I mean, unless RFK basically just goes up there and says, Robert, as you said, like, free the January 6th hostages and, execute the vaccine producers. Unless he does that, and I can't imagine he would. I don't think it helps.
Wow. Okay. Well, there's another big question, but I think we're gonna have to stop here because it's getting. We're at time. We're 10
Well,
minutes.
thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much,
Thank you all.
Oliver.
Yes, thank you very
And
much.
I'm gonna stop recording.
I will say if actually no, this is gonna close. I was gonna put the link to the longer conversation with the